morning air carried the sweet scent of spring flowers as Rose Matthews walked through the iron gates of Oakwood Cemetery. Her hands clutched a small bouquet of white lilies, her grandmother's favorite. 10 years had passed since the day. They laid Grandma Beth to rest, but the weight of her absence still hung heavy in Rose's heart. The cemetery was quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds and the soft rustling of leaves. Rose knew the path by heart. 3rd row from the big oak tree, 5 stones from the left. She had walked this route countless times over the years, first with her father, then alone when visits became too painful for him. "Morning, Grandma," Rose whispered as she knelt down on the soft grass in front of the polished gray stone. "Can't believe it's been 10 years already." She carefully removed the withered flowers from her last visit and replaced them with the fresh lilies. Her fingers traced the engraved letters on the headstone. Elizabeth Ann Matthews, beloved mother and grandmother, 1932-2013. Rose smiled at the small butterfly etching in the corner, a special touch she had insisted on because of how her grandmother had loved watching them flutter through her garden. "Dad's doing better with his heart problems," Rose continued, brushing away a few fallen leaves. "The new medication seems to be working. And Tom got that promotion at work. You'd be proud of him." Talking to her grandmother's grave had become a ritual that brought Rose comfort. Sometimes she could almost hear Grandma Beth's warm laugh or feel her gentle hand on her shoulder. As Rose stood up, something caught her eye. A small, weathered stone a few plots away. She had passed it many times before, but today it seemed to call to her. Unlike the other graves around it, this one had no flowers, no signs that anyone remembered the person buried there, just a simple marker, worn smooth by decades of rain and sun. Rose stepped closer, curious. The stone was so old that the name had faded almost completely. Only a single initial remained visible. M. "Strange," she murmured, feeling an unexpected tug at her heart. Something about this forgotten grave stirred a memory she couldn't quite grasp. "You interested in that old plot?" Rose jumped at the voice behind her. She turned to find an older man in a faded green uniform leaning on a rake. The groundskeeper, she realized. "Sorry to startle you," he said with a kind smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Just don't often see folks paying attention to that one." "Does anyone ever visit this grave?" Rose asked. The groundskeeper, his name tag read Frank, shook his head slowly. "Not in all my years here, and I've been tending these grounds for nearly 3 decades. Well, that's not entirely true." He paused, his weathered face thoughtful. "There was an elderly lady who used to come, sat right on that patch of grass, for hours sometimes, but she stopped coming years ago." A strange chill ran down Rose's spine. "Do you remember what she looked like? This woman?" Frank rubbed his chin. "Gray hair always tied back neat, wore a blue coat most times even in summer, carried a small book with her, a Bible maybe. Never spoke to anyone, just sat quietly." The description tugged at something in Rose's memory, a faint image of her grandmother in her favorite blue wool coat, the one she refused to replace even when the sleeves had frayed. "How long ago did she stop coming?" Rose asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Oh, must be 15, maybe 20 years now." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know her?" "I'm not sure," Rose admitted. "When was this grave placed here, do you know?" "Records say 1976, Frank replied. "One of the older plots in this section. Funny thing is, there's no record of who's buried here. Just that initial and the date." Rose felt a strange hollowness in her stomach. 1976. Her father would have been just a boy then. "You know," Frank said, leaning in slightly. "Some folks say every unmarked grave holds a story someone wanted buried. The kind of truth that doesn't sit easy in family photo albums." His words sent another chill through Rose. She glanced back at her grandmother's well-maintained grave with its fresh flowers and polished stone, then at this neglected plot with its weathered marker. The contrast couldn't be more stark. "Thank you," she said to Frank, who nodded and continued on his rounds. Rose stood there for a long moment, staring at the mysterious grave. Why did it call to her today of all days? And why did the description of that elderly visitor sound so much like her grandmother? As she turned to leave, a flash of memory stopped her. Grandma Beth standing in this very spot, her blue coat pulled tight around her thin frame despite the summer heat. Rose must have been about 8 years old, tugging at her grandmother's hand, eager to leave the boring old cemetery. "Just a minute more, Rosie," Grandma had said, her voice oddly tight. "We need to pay our respects." "But we already put flowers on Grandpa's grave," little Rose had protested. Her grandmother hadn't answered, just stared at this same unremarkable stone with an expression Rose had been too young to understand. Now, 20 years later, standing in the same spot, Rose recognized what she had seen on her grandmother's face. Grief mixed with something deeper, something that looked a lot like guilt. On her drive home, Rose couldn't shake the memory. Had her grandmother been the woman Frank described? The timing fit. Grandma Beth had stopped her regular cemetery visits around the time Rose entered high school, when her arthritis had worsened. But if her grandmother had been visiting that grave, who was buried there, and why had she never mentioned them? Rose pulled into the driveway of her small suburban house, mind still swirling with questions. Inside, the house was quiet. Tom wouldn't be home from work for hours. She dropped her keys on the kitchen counter and headed straight for the hall closet, where she kept boxes of family mementos. She pulled down the one labeled Grandma Beth and carried it to the living room. Inside were photo albums, birthday cards, the handwritten recipe book her grandmother had given her when she married Tom, and a small wooden box containing her grandmother's few pieces of jewelry. Rose began carefully looking through the photos, hoping to find some clue. There were faded color snapshots of family picnics, Christmas mornings, her father as a gangly teenager. Nothing seemed unusual until she reached an old envelope at the bottom of the box. Inside was a black and white photograph she'd never seen before. It showed a much younger version of her grandmother, probably in her 30s, standing beside a hospital bed. In the bed was a young girl with distinct facial features that Rose recognized as signs of Down syndrome. The girl was smiling widely, holding what looked like a small stuffed animal. On the back of the photo, written in her grandmother's neat handwriting, were 3 words: "My sweet Margaret." Rose stared at the photo, her heart beating faster. Margaret? She had never heard her grandmother mention anyone by that name. Not a friend, not a relative. No one in their family was called Margaret as far as she knew. She dug deeper into the box and found a small diary with a faded blue cover. It looked old and well used, the spine cracked from being opened many times. Rose hesitated before opening. Reading someone's private thoughts felt wrong even if that person was long gone. But the mystery of the unmarked grave and this unknown girl named Margaret pulled at her. The diary's pages were filled with her grandmother's familiar handwriting, dated entries spanning several years in the early 1970s. Rose flipped through, scanning the pages until a passage caught her eye. April 17, 1973. Visited Margaret today. The nurses say she's been asking for me. She's growing so tall now, almost a young woman. She remembered the butterfly book I brought last time and asked for more stories about them. I wish I could bring her home, even for a day, just to sit in the garden and watch real butterflies instead of just pictures. Richard says it's better this way, that we've made our decision and must stick with it, that the boys wouldn't understand. But when she holds my hand and smiles at me, I wonder how any decision that keeps her away from us could possibly be right. Rose's hands trembled as she turned to another entry. December 25th, 1973. Christmas at the institution is always so hard. The decorations try to make it cheerful, but the smell of antiseptic and the sound of moaning from some of the rooms can never really feel like holiday. Margaret loved her new sweater and the chocolate I snuck in. She asked if her brothers would ever come see her. I told her maybe someday. Another lie to add to all the others. Richard doesn't even know I still visit. He thinks I'm at church group those afternoons. The boys have stopped asking about where I go. It's like she's already a ghost to them. How did we let this happen? Rose closed the diary, her mind reeling. Her grandmother had another child, a daughter with Down syndrome who had been placed in an institution, a daughter no one in the family ever mentioned, a daughter whose existence had been erased. She looked again at the photograph, at the smiling face of the girl called Margaret. Had her father known about his sister? And was this Margaret the person buried in that unmarked grave? Rose reached for her phone, hands still shaking. She needed to call her father. She needed answers about the grave that had been hiding a painful truth all these years, a truth that could no longer be ignored. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before her father's familiar voice answered. "Dad," Rose said, her voice catching slightly. "I need to ask you something important. Do you know anyone named Margaret?" The long silence that followed told Rose everything she needed to know. The silence on the phone stretched until Rose thought the call might have dropped. "Dad? Are you still there?" Her father cleared his throat. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice sounded strange, hollow. Rose clutched the old photograph in her hand. "I found a picture in Grandma's things. A girl named Margaret. The handwriting on the back is Grandma's." Another long pause, then, "I'm coming over." 40 minutes later, Rose's father, Alan, sat stiffly on her living room couch. At 62, he still had the straight posture from his years in the military, though his once dark hair had turned completely gray. Rose had always thought of her father as solid, unwavering. But now, staring at the photograph and diary on the coffee table between them, he looked fragile. "I found an unmarked grave at the cemetery today," Rose said quietly. The groundskeeper mentioned an elderly woman who used to visit it regularly. He described Grandma Beth perfectly. Alan's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the photograph. "Where did you find this?" "In a box of Grandma's things." "Dad, who is she? The girl in the picture?" Her father set the photo down carefully, as if it might shatter. "Margaret," he said, the name coming out like it hurt his throat. "My sister." Rose felt her chest tighten. "Your sister? But you and Uncle David—" "My older sister," Alan interrupted. "Born 4 years before me. Why have I never heard of her? Why isn't she in any family stories or photos?" Alan looked away, toward the window where afternoon light filtered through the curtains. "Because we were told not to talk about her. Ever." His voice hardened. "People didn't understand back then. Not like now." "Understand what?" Rose pressed, though she already suspected the answer. "Down syndrome." Alan sighed heavily. "When Margaret was born in 1954, the doctor told my parents to put her in an institution. Said she would never learn, never be normal. Said it would be better for everyone that way." Rose thought of the diary entries, of her grandmother's guilt. "But Grandma visited her. She didn't just abandon her." Alan nodded slowly. "Mom visited every month for years. Dad never went, as far as I know. He believed the doctors, that we should move on, pretend she wasn't part of our family. It was different back then. People hid things like this." "Did you ever meet her? Your sister?" Rose asked. A look of pain crossed her father's face. "Once. I was about 6. Mom took me to this place. Big brick building that smelled like bleach. Margaret was there in a room with other kids. She hugged me and gave me a drawing she made. I remember she seemed happy to see us." "What happened then?" "Dad found out Mom had taken me. There was a huge fight. I never went back and we never spoke about her again. It was like she didn't exist." His voice cracked slightly. "I still have the drawing somewhere. She drew butterflies. Lots of them." Rose remembered the butterfly etched on her grandmother's headstone. Not a random choice after all. "The grave," Rose said quietly. "Is that her?" Alan's shoulders slumped. "I think so. Mom never said directly, but Margaret died young, 16 or 17. Something about pneumonia. Mom changed after that, became quieter, spent more time alone. Dad wouldn't let her hold a funeral or mark the grave properly. Said it would raise too many questions." Rose felt a surge of anger. "That's horrible." She was their daughter. Your sister. It was a different time, Alan repeated, though his eyes showed he didn't believe this excused anything. When someone in the family had problems, it was kept quiet, especially in small towns like ours. But why keep the secret going? Grandma's been gone 10 years, Grandpa even longer. Alan looked down at his hands. Habit, I guess. After decades of silence, it just seemed easier to keep it that way. And honestly, I was ashamed, not of Margaret, but of myself, for forgetting her, for letting my parents erase her. Rose reached for her father's hand. It wasn't your fault. You were just a child. I could have asked questions when I got older, could have visited her grave. He shook his head. But I didn't. I just kept the family secret. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of decades of hidden grief filling the room. There's more, Rose said finally, pushing the diary toward her father. Grandma kept a journal about her visits. Alan looked at the diary but didn't touch it. I can't read it, not yet. Rose understood. Some wounds needed time before they could be examined. Do you think Uncle David knows? She asked. I doubt it. He was only 2 when Margaret was sent away. By the time he was old enough to remember anything, she was already gone from our home. I want to know more about her, Rose said firmly, about Margaret's life, what she was like. Alan nodded slowly. Aunt Pamela might know something. Mom's younger sister, they were close once. Aunt Pamela? The one in Woodridge? Rose hadn't seen her great-aunt in years. The elderly woman rarely attended family gatherings. Yes, she and Mom had some kind of falling out after Margaret died. I never knew why. Rose stood up, suddenly determined. I'm going to talk to her. Today, if possible. Alan looked surprised. Why does this matter so much to you? Margaret's been gone for almost 50 years. Because she deserves to be remembered, Rose said simply. Because she was family and someone tried to erase her. That's not right. Her father's eyes filled with tears. No, he agreed quietly. It wasn't right. The drive to Woodridge took nearly 2 hours. Rose called ahead, and to her surprise, Aunt Pamela agreed to see her immediately. Been expecting someone to come asking questions for years, the old woman had said cryptically. Pamela Jenkins lived in a small blue house on the edge of town, its garden wild with colorful flowers. When Rose knocked on the door, it opened to reveal a thin woman with sharp eyes and silver hair cut in a bob. At 81, Pamela still moved with surprising agility. You look like Beth, she said by way of greeting. Come in before the mosquitoes do. The inside of the house was cluttered but clean, filled with books and plants. Pamela led Rose to a sunny kitchen and poured them both iced tea without asking. So, Pamela said, settling into a chair across from Rose. You found out about Margaret. Rose blinked in surprise. How did you know that's why I'm here? What else would bring Elizabeth's granddaughter to my door after all these years? Pamela's voice held no bitterness, just matter-of-fact acceptance. Your father called, said you'd be coming, asked me to tell you whatever I know. Did you know her well? Margaret? Pamela's face softened. I visited her with your grandmother, whenever I could. Sweet girl, loved music, could sing every verse of You Are My Sunshine without missing a word, had the most genuine laugh you ever heard. Rose felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time, Margaret was becoming real, to her. Not just a secret or a tragedy, but a person who sang songs and laughed. What was the institution like? Rose asked. Pamela's expression darkened. Underfunded, understaffed. Some of the workers were kind, but others... She shook her head. Beth fought to get Margaret better care, but Richard, your grandfather, controlled the money. He gave just enough to keep her there, nothing more. Dad mentioned you and Grandma had a falling out. Was it about Margaret? Pamela took a long sip of her tea before answering. In a way. When Margaret died, I wanted Beth to fight Richard, to give her daughter a proper burial, a headstone with her name. But Beth wouldn't stand up to him. Said keeping the peace was more important. So you stopped speaking to her? For a while. It was wrong of me, Pamela admitted. Beth was trapped in her own way. By the time we reconciled, years had passed. Some things are hard to fix once they're broken. The unmarked grave at the cemetery, Rose said. That's Margaret, isn't it? Yes. Beth paid for the plot herself, using money she'd saved from housekeeping funds. Richard never knew, but he forbade her from marking it properly, said the neighbors would ask questions. That's cruel, Rose whispered. It was cruel, Pamela agreed. But cruelty dressed up as protecting the family name was common back then. Rose pulled out her phone and showed Pamela the photograph of Margaret. I found this in Grandma's things. Pamela's eyes filled with tears as she looked at it. I took this picture. It was Margaret's 15th birthday. Beth brought her a chocolate, cake, and that little stuffed dog she's holding. Do you have any other pictures of her? I might, Pamela said, rising slowly. Let me check my albums. She returned with a faded photo album and carefully turned the pages until she found what she was looking for. Here, this is from one of our visits. The photo showed a teenage girl with Down syndrome sitting in a garden. She was laughing, her head thrown back in joy as butterflies fluttered around her. Beside her sat a younger version of Aunt Pamela and Grandma Beth. We snuck her out for the afternoon, Pamela explained. Took her to the botanical garden. She loved it. Kept saying it was like heaven must be. That was about a year before she died. How did she die? Rose asked softly. Pamela's face hardened. Officially pneumonia, but I always suspected neglect played a part. Those places weren't careful with children they deemed defective. Beth suspected it too, but proving anything was impossible. Rose felt tears stinging her eyes. It's not fair, she deserved better. Yes, she did, Pamela agreed quietly. They all did. All those children hidden away because they were different. The world wasn't kind to difference back then. Rose looked again at the photo of Margaret laughing in the garden. I want to know everything about her, she said. Every story, every detail. She shouldn't be forgotten. Pamela reached across the table and squeezed Rose's hand. Then I'll tell you everything I remember. And when we're done, maybe it's time Margaret had her name on her grave. 50 years is long enough to wait for recognition. As the afternoon light faded into evening, Rose listened to Pamela's stories, building a picture of the aunt she never knew existed, the aunt whose grave had been hiding a painful truth that could no longer be ignored. The next morning, Rose sat at her kitchen table surrounded by notes and photocopies Aunt Pamela had given her. There were a handful of additional photographs of Margaret, several birthday cards the girl had made for her mother, and an address for the institution where she had lived and died. Rose traced her finger over a crayon drawing of butterflies and flowers that Margaret had created. The colors were faded now, but the joy in those simple lines was still visible. According to Pamela, Margaret had loved to draw, especially things from nature she rarely got to see. What are you going to do with all this? Tom asked, placing a cup of coffee in front of his wife. He had listened intently the night before as Rose shared everything she'd learned about her forgotten aunt. I need to see where she lived, Rose replied. The institution. Tom sat down across from her, concern etched on his face. Is it even still there? It's been almost 50 years. Pamela says the building is abandoned now. It closed down in the late 80s when these big institutions fell out of favor, but it's still standing. Rose sipped her coffee. I have to go there, Tom. I need to understand what Margaret's life was like. Tom nodded slowly. Do you want me to come with you? Actually, I was thinking of asking my dad to come. He only visited once as a child, I think. I think he needs this as much as I do. After breakfast, Rose called her father. To her surprise, he agreed immediately. I should have done this years ago, he said quietly. Maybe we can pick up Pamela on the way. She would know more about the place than I do. 3 hours later, Rose pulled her car into Aunt Pamela's driveway. The elderly woman was waiting on the porch, dressed in a blue cardigan despite the warm day. In her hands was a small photo album Rose hadn't seen the day before, found a few more pictures. Pamela explained as she carefully settled into the back seat. And I have the visitor's log I kept. Beth and I wrote down every visit. What we brought Margaret, what we did together, things she said. Thought you might want to see it. Thank you, Rose said, touched by her great-aunt's thoroughness in preserving these memories. The drive to Westbrook State Institution took nearly an hour, the final miles along a narrow road winding through thick woods. When they finally turned onto a long gravel driveway, all three fell silent at the sight before them. The institution loomed against the blue sky, a massive brick building with rows of small windows, many now broken or boarded up. Nature was slowly reclaiming the grounds, with weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete walkways and vines crawling up the walls. It looks like something from a horror movie, Rose whispered as she parked the car. For many who lived here, it was, Pamela said grimly. They sat in silence for a moment, gathering courage to approach the building. Finally, Alan opened his door. We didn't come all this way to sit in the car. They walked toward the building, careful to avoid the broken concrete and overgrown areas. A chain-link fence surrounded the property with no trespassing signs posted every few yards, but the main gate hung open, its lock long since broken. We're not going inside, Rose clarified, noticing her father eyeing the boarded-up entrance. Just looking at the outside, I don't think it's safe to enter. Margaret's ward was on the second floor east wing, Pamela said, pointing to a section of the building. See those windows? The corner room was hers, at least for the last few years. Alan stared up at the indicated windows, his expression haunted. I remember those bars on the windows. I asked Mom why they were there. She said it was to keep the children safe. Safe from escaping, more like, Pamela murmured. Rose took out her phone and snapped a few photos. What was it like inside? Cold, Alan said immediately. Not temperature cold, though it was that too, but empty feeling, like a hospital without any of the care. Pamela nodded in agreement. Long hallways with linoleum floors. Rooms with 6 to 8 beds each, no privacy. Few personal possessions. The staff did what they could with limited resources, but it was... She paused, searching for the right word. Institutional. Everything designed for efficiency, not comfort. They walked around to the back of the building where they found the remains of a small garden. A concrete bench, cracked but still standing, faced what had once been flower beds. This is where we took that picture of Margaret with the butterflies, Pamela said. The staff would bring patients out here on nice days. It was one of the few pleasant areas. Alan sat down heavily on the bench. I can't believe she spent her whole life here, my own sister. Not her whole life, Pamela corrected gently. She had almost 6 years at home before your parents sent her away. Beth told me those were happy years. Margaret was loved, at least at first. What changed? Rose asked. Pamela sighed. Pressure. From doctors, from family, from neighbors. People said a child like Margaret would hold back your father and uncle. That she needed professional care. That your grandparents were selfish to keep her at home. That's awful, Rose said. It was common thinking back then. Pamela replied. The so-called experts claimed institutions were better for everyone. Few questioned it publicly, even if they had private doubts. Alan rubbed his hands over his face. I have this memory of someone being taken away. I must have been very young. A woman carrying a small suitcase. My mother crying. I always thought it was a dream, but it was probably the day they brought Margaret here, Pamela said softly. You would have been about 2. They fell silent, each lost in thought as birds chirped in the trees surrounding the abandoned building. Finally, Rose spoke. I found something else in Grandma's papers. Medical records. She pulled a folded paper from her bag. I didn't understand all the terminology, but there was a death certificate. Pamela's expression hardened. What did it say? Cause of death was listed as pneumonia, like you said, but there were notes about malnutrition and bed sores. Alan looked up sharply. Bed sores? How does a 16-year-old get bed sores? By being left in bed too long, by not being turned or moved regularly. Pamela's voice was bitter. By neglect. The notes mentioned staff shortages that winter. Rose continued. Apparently there was a flu outbreak and many workers were out sick. The remaining staff was stretched too thin, so my sister died alone, neglected because there weren't enough people to care for her properly. Alan's voice cracked. Beth suspected as much, Pamela said. She tried to file a complaint, but nothing came of it. These places weren't closely monitored back then. Children like Margaret weren't considered a priority. Alan stood suddenly. I need to walk. He strode away toward the tree line, his shoulders tense. Rose watched her father with concern. This is a lot for him to process. It's a lot for anyone, Pamela agreed. Finding out your parents kept such a secret, that your sister died under such circumstances, it changes how you see your whole family history. After a few minutes, Alan returned, his eyes red but his expression determined. I want to see her records, all of them. And I want to give her a proper headstone. Rose nodded. I was thinking the same thing. I have contacts at the county records office, Pamela said. They might have more documentation about Margaret's time here. Medical reports, visitor logs. Let's do it, Rose said firmly. Let's find everything we can. The county records office was housed in a modern building in the center of town, a stark contrast to the crumbling institution they had just visited. Inside, Pamela greeted the receptionist like an old friend. Nancy, these are my relatives. We're looking for records about a former patient at Westbrook. My niece, Margaret Matthews. Nancy, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, nodded sympathetically. The old institution records were digitized last year. Let me see what I can find. After typing something into her computer, Nancy frowned. That's odd. I'm not finding a Margaret Matthews in the system. Try looking under just the last name, Pamela suggested. Or maybe under Jane Doe. Some children weren't properly registered. Nancy tried several searches before shaking her head. I'm sorry, nothing's coming up. Let me check with Harold in the archives. He managed the digitization project. While they waited, Rose noticed her father becoming increasingly agitated. What if they lost all record of her? He muttered. What if there's nothing left to prove she even existed? We have the photographs, Rose reminded him, and Pamela's memories. Margaret existed, Dad. No one can erase that now. Nancy returned with an older man carrying a large ledger book. Harold thinks he might know what happened. Show them, Harold. The archivist opened the book to a page marked with a sticky note. During digitization, we discovered some patient records had been filed under different names, sometimes just initials or identification numbers. Was Margaret's middle name Anne by any chance? Alan looked surprised. I don't know. Was it? He asked Pamela. Yes, Pamela confirmed. Margaret Ann Matthews. Beth chose the name Anne after her mother. Harold nodded. That explains it. Look here. He pointed to an entry in the ledger. MAM, patient 04673, admitted 1960. Why would they record her by initials? Rose asked. Harold's expression grew uncomfortable. Sometimes, particularly with certain patients, families requested discretion. Names were abbreviated to maintain privacy. To hide them, you mean? Pamela said sharply. To pretend they didn't exist. Harold didn't argue. If this is your relative, her full records would be filed under this patient number. Let me see what I can locate for you. 20 minutes later, they sat at a table in a private room, surrounded by folders containing Margaret's institutional life. Medical evaluations, educational assessments, incident reports, visitor logs, the paper trail of a life spent behind brick walls. Look at this, Rose said, holding up a school report. Her teacher says she was excellent at memorizing songs and poems, that she was unusually empathetic toward other patients. Alan picked up a medical evaluation. It says here she could read at a basic level, that she knew colors, shapes, could count to 20. His voice filled with wonder. The doctors told my parents she would never learn anything. They were wrong about a lot of things, Pamela said simply. As they continued examining the records, a picture emerged of Margaret's life. The small triumphs, the daily routines, the visits from her mother that were faithfully logged every month for over 10 years. But there were darker entries too. Restraints used during episodes of distress, medications administered to keep patients manageable, the gradual decline in her health during that final winter. The last entry, Rose said softly, reading from the final page. Patient passed at 3:17 a.m. No family present. Body transferred to county services for burial arrangements. Alan closed his eyes briefly. She died alone. Beth didn't know until the next day, Pamela added. They called her in the morning. By then, Margaret was already gone. They gathered the most important documents to photocopy, creating a record they could take with them. As they prepared to leave, Harold approached with one last folder. I found this in a separate file. It might be of interest. Inside was a small collection of artwork, crayon drawings and watercolor paintings, each signed with a wobbly M. Butterflies, flowers, birds, and in nearly every picture 2 figures holding hands, one tall, one small. She saved every picture Margaret gave her, Pamela whispered. Beth brought art supplies on every visit. Rose carefully placed the artwork with their other copies. Now we know her story. Now we can make sure she's remembered. As they walked, out into the afternoon sunlight, the weight of the past still heavy but somehow more bearable now that it was shared, Alan spoke with newfound resolution. Tomorrow we're going to order a proper headstone, with her full name, Margaret Ann Matthews, and butterflies, lots of butterflies. The morning light filtered through the blinds as Rose spread the documents across her dining room table. She had spent most of the night organizing everything they had gathered about Margaret, the photographs, medical records, artwork, and Pamela's visitor logs. It felt important to arrange it all chronologically, to see the full arc of her aunt's short life. You've been up all night, haven't you? Tom asked, placing a cup of coffee beside her. Rose nodded, rubbing her tired eyes. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about how different her life might have been if she'd been born 30 years later. Tom looked over the carefully arranged timeline. What will you do with all this? Create a memory book, I think. Something permanent. Rose picked up one of Margaret's butterfly drawings. But first we're meeting with a monument maker today. Dad's determined to give her a proper headstone. Later that morning, Rose picked up her father and Aunt Pamela. The monument company was located in a small building near the edge of town, with sample headstones displayed in the front yard like strange garden ornaments. Inside, a middle-aged man with kind eyes introduced himself as George, the owner. He listened carefully as they explained what they wanted. So this would be a replacement stone for an existing grave? He asked. Yes, Alan replied. Currently there's just a small marker, with the initial M. We want to replace it with something proper. George nodded, pulling out a catalog. We have several options that might work. The cemetery might have regulations about size and style, so we should check that first. We want her full name, Rose said firmly. Margaret Ann Matthews. Her birth and death dates. And butterflies in the design. Butterflies were special to her, Pamela added. She rarely got to see real ones, being confined indoors most of her life. But she loved pictures of them, drew them constantly. George nodded. We can definitely incorporate butterflies. Did you have a particular type in mind? They hadn't thought that far, but Pamela immediately said, monarchs. Beth always said Margaret was like a monarch butterfly, beautiful and meant to be free. As they looked through design options, Alan grew quiet, his expression troubled. What's wrong, Dad? Rose asked softly. I was just thinking about what people will say. The family has kept this secret for so long. Now suddenly there'll be a new headstone with her name on it. People will ask questions. Let them ask, Pamela said firmly. It's time for truth, not more silence. Besides, Rose added, anyone who would judge a family for acknowledging a child with Down syndrome isn't worth worrying about. Alan nodded slowly. You're right. I'm still carrying my father's shame, aren't I? That stops now. After finalizing the headstone design, a simple but elegant gray granite with Margaret's name, dates, and a border of monarch butterflies, they discussed the installation timeline. It typically takes about 8 weeks, George explained. But I might be able to expedite it given the circumstances. Thank you, Alan said. It's already 50 years overdue. Later that afternoon, Rose called her Uncle David. As the younger brother, he had no memory of Margaret at all, and was shocked to learn of her existence. A sister? Are you sure? He kept asking, his voice a mixture of disbelief and hurt. Why? Would they keep that from us? Different times, Rose explained, repeating what her father and Pamela had told her. They thought it was better that way. Better for who? David asked bitterly. Not for her locked away like that. Not for us growing up with this hole in our family we didn't even know existed. Rose invited him to come see the documents and photographs they'd gathered. We're putting together the pieces of her life. You should be part of that. The next day, David arrived with his wife, Carol. He and Alan embraced longer than usual, their shared discovery creating a new bond between them. I brought something, David said, pulling a small box from his pocket. I found it in Dad's desk after he died. Never knew what it meant. He opened the box to reveal a small silver butterfly pin. Think it might have been hers? Pamela's eyes widened in recognition. Beth gave that to Margaret on her 13th birthday. She wore it every day. How did Richard end up with it? The institution would have returned her personal effects after she died, Rose suggested. Maybe he kept it even though he never visited her. Alan stared at the pin. So he did acknowledge her, in his way. Just never publicly. People are complicated, Pamela said softly. Richard wasn't a monster. He was a product of his time. Following what doctors and society told him was right, that doesn't excuse what happened, but it helps explain it. They spent the afternoon going through all the materials together, with David asking countless questions about the sister he never knew. Rose noticed how her father seemed to grow more comfortable talking about Margaret as the day went on, as if each mention of her name made her more real to him again. I've been thinking, Rose said as they looked through Margaret's artwork. We should find out if there are other unmarked graves at the cemetery. Children from the institution who might have been buried without proper headstones. The others looked at her with surprise. Margaret can't be the only one, Rose continued. If this was common practice back then, there must be others. The records. We saw mentioned county services handling burial arrangements, Alan noted. Where would those records be kept? County clerk's office, probably, Pamela suggested. Or maybe the cemetery itself has records. David leaned forward, suddenly engaged. I know someone who works for the Historical Society. They've been documenting old records for years. Let me make a call. 2 days later, they gathered at the Oakwood Cemetery office, a small building near the entrance gates. David's contact at the Historical Society, a researcher named Pat, had arranged a meeting with the cemetery director. The director, an older woman named Vivian, brought out several large ledger books. These record all burials from 1950 to 1990. What exactly are you looking for? Graves of children from Westbrook Institution, Rose explained, specifically any that might be unmarked or marked only with initials or numbers. Vivian's expression changed. Ah, the Westbrook graves. She turned to a specific section of one ledger. They're all in the east section, near where your family member is buried. The institution had an arrangement with the cemetery. Reduced. Rates for simple burials, minimal markers. How many are there? Alan asked. Vivian ran her finger down several pages of entries. From what I can see, at least 37 over a 30-year period. Some have proper headstones, purchased by families later. Most don't. Pat, the historical researcher, had been taking notes. We've been documenting cases like this across the state. Institutions like Westbrook were common, and many patients who died there were buried with minimal recognition. It was a widespread practice. It's not right, Rose said, feeling a familiar anger rising. These were people with names and lives. They shouldn't be forgotten. What can we do? Alan asked, looking at the pages of entries. Pat smiled. Actually, there's a project you might be interested in. Several advocacy groups have been working to identify unmarked institutional graves and provide proper memorials. They've had success in other counties. We'd like to help, Rose said immediately, looking to her father and uncle for confirmation. They both nodded. It won't be easy, Pat warned. Records are incomplete. Finding family members after all this time is challenging. And there's the cost of new markers. We'll figure it out, Alan said firmly. Margaret led us to this for a reason. Over the next several weeks, Rose found herself completely immersed in what they now called the Margaret Project. She took a leave of absence from her job to focus on researching the other Westbrook patients buried at Oakwood. Working with Pat and a small team of volunteers from a disability rights organization, they painstakingly cross-referenced cemetery records with institutional files, searching for the stories behind each unmarked grave. Some cases were relatively straightforward. They found names, dates, and occasionally surviving family members who had lost touch with institutionalized relatives decades ago. Other graves proved more challenging, with patients identified only by numbers in the cemetery records. It's like they tried to
make these people disappear completely, Rose said one evening as she and her father sorted through photocopied records spread across her living room floor.
Not just during their lives, but even in death. Alan nodded grimly. The more I learn about how these institutions operated, the more thankful I am that you found Margaret's grave, that you didn't let her story stay buried. The work was emotionally draining but brought unexpected rewards. They connected with families who, like them, had grown up with holes in their family trees, missing aunts, uncles, cousins, and siblings who had been institutionalized and rarely mentioned again. I never knew I had an aunt, one woman told Rose, tearfully after they located her mother's older sister's grave. My mother sometimes mentioned wanting a sister when she was growing up. I never realized she actually had one. With each discovery, with each family reunion, Rose felt they were healing wounds that had festered in silence for generations. The local newspaper ran a story about their project, which attracted more volunteers and donations for new headstones. A retired nurse who had worked at Westbrook in its final years came forward with additional records she had saved from being destroyed when the institution closed. They wanted to throw everything away, she explained. Like these lives didn't matter. I couldn't let that happen. 6 weeks after their visit to the monument company, George called to say Margaret's headstone was ready for installation. They arranged for a small ceremony the following Saturday. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and cool. Rose arrived early to place fresh flowers near the small marker that had stood anonymously for so long. Soon others joined her. Alan and his wife David and Carol, Pamela, Tom, and to Rose's surprise, several families they had connected with through their research. Pat came with a local minister who had agreed to say a few words. Even Frank, the cemetery groundskeeper who had first told Rose about the mysterious grave, stood respectfully at a distance. As they gathered around, workers carefully removed the small marker with the single initial M and prepared the ground for the new headstone. When they unveiled it, Rose felt tears spring to her eyes. There it was, finally, Margaret's name carved in stone, surrounded by delicate butterfly engravings. Margaret Ann Matthews, 1954 and 1971, beloved daughter and sister. She was more than a secret, Alan said, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the small gathering. She was a person who deserved to be remembered, who deserved to have her name spoken out loud. Pamela stepped forward and placed the silver butterfly pin at the base of the new headstone. Beth would be so happy to see this, to know Margaret is finally being honored properly. As the minister spoke about remembrance and reconciliation, Rose looked around at the gathered faces, family members healing old wounds, volunteers committed to restoring dignity to forgotten lives, and in the distance, the still unmarked graves they had yet to identify. There was still so much work to do, so many names to reclaim. But today, at least, one grave no longer hid its painful truth. Today, Margaret had come home to her family at last. 1 year later, Rose stood at the entrance of Oakwood Cemetery, watching as people gathered for what had become an annual event, the Remembrance Day ceremony. What had started as a small family project to honor Margaret had grown into something much larger than she could have imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds as volunteers placed flowers on each of the graves they had identified over the past year. 32 of the 37 unmarked institutional burials now had proper headstones, each bearing a name, dates, and a small butterfly symbol that had become the unofficial emblem of their project. "I still can't believe how much has changed in a year," Tom said, slipping his arm around Rose's waist as they watched the preparations. Rose nodded, thinking back to that first day when she had noticed the weathered stone with the single initial. From one grave to all this. What had begun as the Margaret Project had evolved into the Butterfly Memorial Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to identifying and properly marking institutional graves across the state. Rose had left her marketing job to run the foundation full-time, with her father and uncle serving on the board alongside several family members of other institutional residents they had connected with through their work. "Rose," a voice called from across the lawn. She turned to see Luis waving from beside a newly installed bench. Luis had found them 6 months ago while searching for information about his great-uncle, who had been institutionalized as a child with cerebral palsy. Now he was one of their most dedicated volunteers. "The display boards are all set up," he called. "And the choir just arrived." Rose gave him a thumbs up and checked her watch. The ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. She felt the familiar flutter of nervous energy in her stomach, not from public speaking. She had become comfortable with that over the past year, but from the knowledge of what this day meant to so many families. "There's Dad," she said, spotting her father helping an elderly woman from her car. Alan had transformed over the past year, channeling his regret over Margaret into determined advocacy. At 63, he had found a new purpose that energized him. "I need to check on the refreshments for after the ceremony," Tom said. "You okay here?" Rose nodded, watching as more people arrived. Families they had helped, community members, even a few local politicians who had supported their efforts to change how county records documented institutional burials. Pamela approached, leaning on a cane but moving with purpose. At 82, she remained the foundation's historian, her memories of Margaret and Westbrook Institution providing context that dusty records couldn't capture. "Quite a turnout," she observed, surveying the growing crowd. "Beth would be amazed." "I think she knows," Rose said softly. Somehow. They walked together toward Margaret's grave, now the centerpiece of a special section of the cemetery dedicated to honoring former institutional residents. Her headstone stood out not for its size or grandeur, but for the fresh flowers that always adorned it. A different arrangement each week, brought by various members of the Matthews family who had embraced their newfound relative. Rose adjusted, a photograph that stood on a small easel beside the grave, Margaret laughing in the botanical garden surrounded by butterflies. They had enlarged and framed the image, wanting visitors to see the joy in her face, to know her as a person, not just a name on a stone. "We found another 3 families last week," Rose told Pamela as they stood before the grave. All looking for relatives who passed through Westbrook. One man had been searching for his brother for 40 years. "Were you able to help him?" Rose nodded. "We found records of his brother's transfer to another facility in 1964, then burial in a cemetery, about 50 miles from here. He's visiting the grave for the first time tomorrow." Pamela squeezed Rose's hand. "Every stone you uncover, every name you bring back, it's healing more than just graves. It's healing people." As they talked, David approached with a middle-aged woman Rose recognized as a reporter from the state newspaper. "Rose, this is Kate. She's doing a feature on today's ceremony and wanted to ask you a few questions about how everything started." Rose smiled at the reporter. "It started with one grave that refused to stay hidden." After a brief interview, Rose excused herself to prepare for the ceremony. As she walked toward the podium that had been set up on the lawn, she saw Frank, the groundskeeper who had first told her about the elderly woman visiting the unmarked grave. He gave her a nod of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of how far things had come. At 11 o'clock, Rose stepped up to the microphone. Before her sat about 100 people, families who had discovered lost relatives, advocates for disability rights, local residents, and even a few former Westbrook employees who had come forward to help with their records and recollections. "Welcome to our first annual Remembrance Day," Rose began, her voice clear in the quiet cemetery. "A year ago, my family discovered a secret that had been buried for nearly 50 years. My Aunt Margaret, a young woman with Down syndrome who spent most of her life in an institution and was buried in an unmarked grave upon her death in 1971. She paused, looking out at the attentive faces. What we thought was just our family's hidden pain turned out to be part of a much larger story. A story shared by thousands of families across the country whose loved ones were institutionalized, separated, and sometimes forgotten." Rose gestured toward the newly marked graves surrounding them. "Each of these stones represents not just a person, but a reconnection. Families finding missing pieces of their history, communities acknowledging a painful past, and all of us committing to a more inclusive future." The ceremony continued with a local choir singing "You Are My Sunshine," Margaret's favorite song according to Pamela's visitor logs, and brief remarks from several family members who had found their relatives through the foundation's work. Alan spoke about the importance of confronting difficult truths, no matter how long they had been hidden. "Secrets don't protect us," he said, his voice strong despite the emotion behind his words. "They isolate us. Every family reunited with their past becomes stronger, not weaker." A young woman with Down syndrome read a poem she had written about belonging and remembrance, her clear voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. Rose watched the faces in the audience, seeing tears and smiles as the young woman confidently delivered her verses. After the formal ceremony, people lingered, visiting the graves, examining the display boards that told the stories of various Westbrook residents and sharing memories with one another. Rose moved through the crowd, listening to conversations, accepting thanks, and directing people to resources. Near Margaret's grave, she found her father deep in conversation with an elderly man she didn't recognize. "Rose," Alan called, waving her over. "This is Dr. Wilson. He was a medical resident at Westbrook in 1970. Rose felt a momentary tension. They had encountered several former Westbrook staff over the past year, with mixed experiences. Some had been defensive about the institution's practices, while others expressed regret and a desire to help make amends. "I was there during Margaret's final illness," Dr. Wilson said quietly. "I've wanted to speak with your family for some time, but wasn't sure I'd be welcome." "What can you tell us?" Rose asked, keeping her voice neutral. The elderly doctor's eyes were sad but direct. "I was young, just starting my career. The conditions at Westbrook troubled me deeply, but I didn't have the courage or position to change things." He paused. "I remember Margaret. She had a kind word for everyone, even when she was very ill." "Were you there when she died?" Alan asked. Dr. Wilson nodded. "I was on duty that night. The staff was stretched impossibly thin due to budget cuts and a flu outbreak. I did everything I could for her, but we lacked proper equipment, proper staffing." His voice trailed off. "I've carried that night with me for 50 years. When I saw the newspaper article about your foundation, I knew I needed to come today." From his pocket, he pulled a small, worn notebook. "I kept private notes about my patients, separate from the official records. Things I noticed, conversations we had. I thought you might want to have what I wrote about Margaret." With slightly shaking hands, he passed the notebook to Alan. "Page 43. Alan opened the notebook carefully, finding the indicated page. As he read, tears filled his eyes. "She asked about butterflies," he said softly. Her last coherent words were, asking if there would be butterflies where she was going. Dr. Wilson nodded. "I told her there would be. More than she could count." Rose felt her own eyes filling with tears. This small detail, her aunt's final thoughts, felt like a precious gift, a last piece of the puzzle they had been assembling. "Thank you for coming today," she said to the doctor, "and for preserving this memory." As the afternoon progressed, the crowd gradually thinned. Rose found herself back at Margaret's grave, sitting on the small bench they had installed nearby. The cemetery was peaceful now, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the headstones. Tom found her there, sitting quietly beside her. "Successful day," he said after a moment. "More than I could have hoped," Rose agreed. "Did you see how many people wrote in the memory book? Over 100 stories and connections." "What's next for the foundation?" Tom asked. Rose smiled. "We're expanding to 2 more counties next month. There are at least 60 more institutional graves to identify at the Pine Ridge Cemetery, and we've been contacted by a historical society in Westville about similar unmarked graves there." She looked out over the cemetery, at the stones that now proudly displayed names and dates where once there had been only anonymity. "And we're creating an educational program for schools. About the history of institutions, yes, but more importantly, about the value of every life, the importance of inclusion." "Margaret would be proud," Tom said. "I think so too." Rose touched the butterfly engraving on her aunt's headstone. From one hidden grave to all of this. Sometimes the most painful truths, once faced, lead to the most healing. As they prepared to leave, Rose noticed a young family approaching Margaret's grave. The mother held the hand of a small girl with Down syndrome, who carried a colorful drawing. Rose watched as the child carefully placed her artwork beside the photograph of Margaret. It was a picture of butterflies, dozens of them, flying free, against a bright blue sky. The little girl looked up at Rose and smiled. "They're not hiding anymore," she said simply, pointing to her butterflies. "Now everyone can see them." Rose nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The truth that had been buried in that grave for so long wasn't just about Margaret, or even about the painful history of institutionalization. It was about visibility, about acknowledgement, about the fundamental human need to be seen and remembered. As she walked away, Rose glanced back one last time at Margaret's grave, now adorned with flowers, photographs, and a child's drawing. What had once been hidden was now impossible to ignore, a testament to a life that mattered, a truth that had finally found its way into the light.